The big thing is that you're trying to capture those manure nutrients and you're trying to have less tractor start.
Winter feeding costs take a lot of profit away from your ranch, and often we find ourselves working for the cow. So what are some alternatives?
You just want to figure out how can these cows work for me, get their adequate nutrients, utilize that extensive system, leave their nutrients on that nutrient deficient area, and at the same time, you're saving money.
Dr. Bart Lardner from the University of Saskatchewan discusses what they have found in their research on bale grazing, swath grazing, and crop residual grazing. Yeah, I know these aren't necessarily new concepts, and you might be saying, well, that can't work in our operation. Well, here's a quote I heard a long time ago: "Can't never did anything." Now, as we discuss these alternative grazing practices, you're going to hear some very practical and easy to employ methods about how you can utilize the free nutrients from the south end of a northbound cow on this episode of the Working Ranch Radio Show. And welcome here to the Working Ranch Radio Show. I'm Justin Mills. Thanks for tuning in and joining us on today's program, coming to you as we do each and every week through a couple different formats. Of course, for those of you listening right here on the radio, thanks for tuning in. And by the way, if you have to step out and cut a bale string and you missed something, it's pretty easy to go back and listen to our shows by going to our podcast site at workingranchradio.com. Or if you have a preferred method like Spotify, for example, you can go there. Just search Working Ranch Radio Show. You're going to find a way to listen to our programs, and really a lot of our shows, as I've said many, many times over, are applicable no matter when you listen to them. By the way, if you're listening on a podcast platform, be sure to leave us a rating and review. That's always much appreciated as well. Now, before we jump into the program, I did want to mention this because I've been talking about it for the last couple of weeks, that the latest issue of Working Ranch magazine is out. Well, lo and behold, mine showed up in the mailbox last week. Keep in mind, we don't get mail as often as probably other folks do. So it did come, and able to get through that a little bit. Now, one article that I would point out here, and it starts on page 32. It's in regards to pasture management by Loretta Sorensen writing that article. And I know there's probably not a ranch operation out there that you don't deal with weeds of some sort. Some definitely are very hard to deal with, and others can be grazed. And I think there's some good information in this article here, amongst other resources in this issue of Working Ranch Magazine. As always, completely full of very useful information. If you don't have a subscription, you can go to their website at workingranchmag.com and start your subscription here today. Now, speaking of Working Ranch Magazine, the Captain Tim O'Byrne, editor, will be in coming up later on with this week's edition of Tim's Two Cents, and we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day with his view on what he anticipates for this long-term weather outlook, and says things could be starting to get a little bit colder and winter pattern coming up. He'll give us an insight onto what he's thinking on our long-term weather outlook coming up later in the show. Well, as we turn towards our program here today, I'm pleased to have Dr. Bart Lardner, who is with the University of Saskatchewan and their Department of Animal Science, joining us, a professor there. And Dr. Lardner, thanks for being here today on the Working Ranch Radio Show.
Well, no problem, Justin. Thank you for the invitation.
Our subject and what we're going to talk about today is very applicable to this time of year. A lot of us are looking at, if we haven't already, starting to put a little feed to these cows. But the reality of it is, in our beef industry, and we've talked about it here on the Working Ranch Radio Show at many different times, is feed costs are some of our highest costs that all of us in the ranching business can have. Now, I say can because there are options, and we're going to talk about that today, but really that's been the precedence of a lot of your study and your research that you've been doing for a lot of years.
Yeah, we've been going at this for over 28 years now, and really my whole program is applied cow-calf forage research, and so we're just trying to look at alternatives for producers in Western Canada and even down there in the U.S. for you folks, and it's very applicable. So we're thinking, as you just suggested, feed is the biggest cost for winter feeding, probably 65% of keeping that cow in your farm or your ranch. And so really, I look at how the beef industry has evolved in the 50s and 60s. We did grass our animals out on pasture, brought them back in September, October, and then we put them into those dry lock pens and fed them in pens over several months and calved in those pens, wonder why we're putting up with scours. But I think that was kind of the European way of doing things. And I think that we realize in the last decade or 15 years that, the cow has legs. She can walk to the forage or the feed. And in my mind, it's all about finding that nutrient deficient acre of land on your farm or your ranch. And so, is there a possibility to maybe winter those cows out on that area that needs some rejuvenation, which is a topic that all producers like to hear about? And in my mind, it's feeding them out there and getting the benefits of the manure nutrients on that nutrient deficient acre or field on your farm or your ranch.
Mm-hmm. What I think is interesting, and we're going to be talking about some specific things, such as bale grazing, swath grazing, crop residuals, a lot of those things we're going to get into later on. But what I find is interesting, Dr. Lardner, is that you guys are doing this, and I feel in some ways that Canada has maybe been a little bit more progressive in winter grazing because you've had to.
Yeah, we've had to. We're very lucky. We have a very cold, dry winter here. So we can, given that we're putting out adequate forages, basal forages with good nutritive value to meet her energy protein requirements, that she can go out there and utilize them in that extensive system. So that's an advantage that we have here in Western Canada, and you do too in where you folks ranch or farm.
And I ask that question mainly to lead into the fact that if you can do it up there, we can do it in more southern latitudes, don't you think?
Yes, yeah, I do. And even if you don't have that dry, cold winter, and it might do the freeze thaw business, but you're correct. So we're focused more on this whole integration of the animal, the plant, the soil. We hear these terms called regenerative agriculture. We hear lots about soil health. In my mind, it's just using that ruminant out there on that acre of land and having her, recycling those nutrients. It's just a good thing versus in a dry lot system where those nutrients are sitting in that straw pack. And I'll get into that when we talk about bale grazing, but it's just taking advantage of that ammonium and nitrate, nitrogen, and phosphorus coming out the back door in the feces and urine. That's as simple as that.
Mm-hmm. How have you dealt with folks in certain geographical areas with more trees, specifically a pine type tree, or I don't know if spruce has the same issues that we deal with, pine needle abortion that can happen with pregnant cows. But that's always been an issue for folks that are in that type of topography or geography, I should say, that are dealing with that and feel like, well, we can't put them out and graze because they're going to get into the needles and we don't want that to happen.
Yeah, and it's just not the pine needle issue. It can be also, you have obviously wildlife out there. We have lots of challenges up here with elk and deer, utilizing those feed resources that were supposed to be for your commercial cow herd. So if it may be an annual crop field, we've done that work on annual crop fields as well as perennial pastures. And so it takes a while to find that site. It doesn't have to be big, and if it is winter range or even native range land, we've seen some folks do these practices on their native range land as well. So you just have to do your homework and say, okay, this is probably going to be the best fit wherever I live, and start small. This is the big thing I tell producers: start small. Don't go crazy. Start out with 5 acres, 10 acres, and just warm up to the system and work the kinks out for it. What works in Manitoba, what works in Wyoming, what works in Nebraska is going to be different. And, if you're thinking about an alternative system versus starting tractors and mixer wagons and feeding in a dry lot system, and really it's up to the individual to make that decision. Yes, I want to integrate that particular alternative. And I do lots of talks, and you know what? I get questions after the Q&A after I talk, but it's really after when I go back for a coffee in the back of the room that the son or the daughter come up to me and say, "Hey, Bart, how do I get Dad to change his way of managing the cow herd throughout the calendar year?" And I say, just start small. Maybe this system won't work for you. Maybe that system won't work for you. But if there's any way you can look at reducing your feed cost per cow per day by feeding out somehow, some way, that's a plus versus that that intensive system, where you're having to incur those yardage costs and paid, unpaid labor, all those things. So a lot of the work we've done has shown that 20 to 30% reduced feed cost per cow per day because of integration of these extensive systems. And so it's going to be a hard conversation. It's going to be a challenging conversation, but it is difficult to change, and that's fine. But I think if you can show that you are going to reduce your your overwintering cost, there's an advantage there.
You bet. Okay, well, let's take a break here, Bart, and when we come back, let's start jumping into some of the specific things. I think the first thing we'll get into is bale grazing, so let's do that when we come back after the break.
Sounds great.
Well, this segment today brought to you by Barn Owl. It's what we use here in our ranching operations to just have a peace of mind and knowing what's going on. Here at our home X-Ring Ranch home place, we've got another ranch location 30 miles to the north, and it's nice to keep an eye on things, whether it's a water tank or fuel tanks or an entry gate, whatever that might be, to just a variety of things that you can use a remote camera. It kind of gives you that peace of mind and helps you sleep a little bit better at night. Check it out for yourself. Go to their website at barnowl.tech. Are you tired of putting the wear and tear on your ranch pickup or your good side-by-side out checking stock tanks or reservoirs? Or maybe it's just keeping an eye on a remote ranch location. When you stop and you think about it and you start to calculate the cost of your time, fuel, and miles on your vehicles, you're going to scare yourself. But there really is a very simple and a reassuring solution, and it's called Barn Owl. Barn Owl off-grid cameras and smart alerts provide you that assurance, and there's no question it is a time and a money saver. From anywhere at any time, no Wi-Fi or power needed. Build your off-grid camera system today at barnowl.tech. Real-time awareness starts here. Always know with Barn Owl. You know, today we're talking about how you can simplify and reduce your cost in feeding. And sometimes if you're going to try to utilize some poor quality forage that might be out there, supplements are your options to be doing that. And if you want to improve your herd's health and simplify your feeding routine, one option is SmartLick low moisture tubs. They're an answer to doing this. Self-fed, weather resistant, and convenient. You know, SmartLick is packed with everything that cow's going to need to balance her diet, support weight gain, and improve productivity. Now, SmartLick, it's not just another tub. It is a dependable way to get some results. If you want to find out more or find a dealer, you can go to their website at smartlick.com. Again, that's smartlic.com. Well, as we continue on now here on the Working Ranch Radio Show, our guest today is Dr. Bart Lardner out of the University of Saskatchewan. He's in the Department of Animal Science, a professor there, and has spent many years with researching applied cow-calf research in really ways that for the cow-calf producer to be efficient and economical with what they do. We're talking specifically at addressing winter feed costs and extending that grazing period, how we can do that and reduce those feed costs. Dr. Lardner, let's talk about bale grazing first. There's some other things we're going to get into, swath grazing, residuals, corn grazing as well. But let's talk about bale grazing because that has really been something we've heard. It's been around for a while. It's not like it's relatively new. But at the same time, I think it's one of those things people like myself a little nervous about just jumping into. So we will start there, and then if I've got questions, we can go back and forth on that.
Yeah, bale grazing is something that we've done some research on, and you're right, it's been around for quite a few years. It's a technique where you're thinking outside the box. Like typically you would make your round bales, 1,500-pound round bales, and put them into a round bale feeder in a dry lot system, feed the cows that way over the winter months. But unfortunately, over time, you get those nutrients in that straw pack. And a couple of things is that, nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient. And so when we go to clean those pens or clean that manure, to spread that manure out on our fields weeks or months later, a lot of that nitrogen is gone through volatilization or runoff. And so we come back to, okay, you know what? Maybe we can place these bales somewhere else on our operation. And maybe is there a field or a pasture or something that needs some rejuvenation? And you got to scratch your head and look around, and it doesn't have to be big. It could be a small 5-acre chunk. It maybe could be a larger area, 40-acre piece. And so we've seen producers do all types of permutations and combinations. And so they might put out feed for just a week. They might put out enough bales for maybe a month. We have some folks up here in Manitoba that set up different pods around their operation. So they'll have 20 days of grazing here and 30 days of grazing there. And so they're just extending the grazing season where the cattle are out in the field. Mm-hmm. So we place our bales typically in a grid pattern, depending on how many bales and how long we want to have the cattle out there, and about 15 feet apart. And for us, we're using a portable electric fence. Generally, we're going to use a high tensile perimeter on that. And then we're going to use poly just to allocate that fresh grazing And we've always suggested 3 to 4 days of new allocation of grazing. And that's just our producers were going to do whatever they do. So they'll go 7 days, they'll go 2 weeks, whatever. But in my mind, if you're going to use bale grazing, you have to have just enough cows. If you have just 5 cows and you give them 3 bales, they have all day to soil, to pick and choose, and bed on that. And so in my mind, you're going to have just the right number of cows out there if you're going to take the system on.
Mm-hmm. So what about if you, like in our case here, I'm using hay as a supplement, not as a much for a lot of their feed requirements, because I've still got grass that we've saved back and are going to be going to. How will that work? I mean, because my thought as you were saying that, they're going to eat it all in one day, and then for the next 6-7 days, they're not going to have any supplement.
Right. No, I think in your case where you're using stockpiled grass or winter range, that's your basal forage. And so you're trying to give them that alfalfa hay as a protein supplement so that they can utilize that low quality basal forage. And we don't want to have them just consuming the hay, because we call that a substitution effect, where they're consuming more supplement than the basal forage that you want them to consume. And so in that scenario, I think that's one system that works for you folks down there. Now, in my mind, you probably wouldn't be putting alfalfa hay out there. What generally we see is producers having a lower quality grass hay, or they might even have a barley hay, like a green feed too. But I talked about this last week when I was speaking in Nebraska, is that, just don't use the same type of hay. You might have some really low quality grass hay, poor quality, maybe sitting about 6-7% protein, but you might bring in maybe a couple of better mixed grass legume hay bales, and then have a couple of straw bales too. So I go back to the right number of cows. I really feel that if you got a pod of about 100 plus cows, that's kind of the right number. Because if you have too few, they have all day to select and soil and bed. If you have enough, you've got one cow's thinking about taking that bite of hay. Well, guess what? His friends have already consumed it. And so you're just eliminating preference and palatability. So you're only putting out enough hay for 3 or 4 days at whatever it might be, 30 pounds per head per day, plus or minus 10% residue. So if you have those cows out there and you have that, take away that preference and palatability, we generally see that they're going to utilize the majority of that feed. And the big thing about bale grazing is there's going to be residue, and that's going to be a uncomfortable situation for the producer. But if you strive to maybe just leave 10% or less residue, that's going to be utilized to improve that soil characterization or organic matter in that area that needed that inputs of nutrients.
Let's continue on the conversation about the benefits of this. You've already addressed quite a few of them. I mean, we're talking about the nutrients back into the soil that's coming from the animal, and of course the biomass that's left on top of the ground. Those some of the benefits. Is there anything else benefit wise?
Well, the big thing is that I think that the cows are healthier. They do a lot more walking in a bale grazing system to and from the water point. Make sure there's adequate shelter out there too. That's a big thing. You have natural shelter belt, trees that are out there, or we use portable windbreaks up here. So the other thing too is that we have some folks that are asking their cows to snow graze, and we can't do it at the research facility, but it has to be soft, fluffy. It can't be crusted, and the cows have to be adapted to know that snow grazing is their water source. And so I've had a lot of folks try to phone me up on a very cold day in January, and they're trying to train their cows to snow graze. And we hear lots of vocalization in the background. So guess what? Train them when it's a little bit warmer. Don't be training them when you have that sub-zero for that week long.
Yeah. The water element's important. How far can they walk to water? You feel that it's okay to be walking? I mean, walking is a healthy thing, so there's nothing wrong with it, but at some point it might be too far.
Yeah. I always suggest that, if that water point is 3/4 of a mile, or maybe up to a mile, that's okay. Up here, we put out winter watering systems for our cows, but if it's a nice cold and it's a clear day and the sun's shining, she's got a good body condition score, she's going to lick snow. She's not going to go and find that insulated water trough to consume water. The other thing that I really focus on, or make sure that you're aware of, when these cows are coming off that summer program or that fall program, I want them to be in adequate body condition. And so we're a 1 to 5 up here, so they need to come in about a 3. You folks are 1 to 9 down there, so they should be coming in about a 5 or a 6.
Okay.
And that's an average body condition. And I want to maintain body condition over that winter feeding, that bale grazing program. That's my objective, is to maintain body condition. They come into calving in that moderate body condition because thin cows don't rebreed. So we don't want them to go backwards, is my point.
You bet. Let's talk real quick about some of the challenges with bale grazing.
Yeah, some of the challenges are the producer getting used to putting out the right amount of feed so that you have that residue that you're comfortable with leaving behind, good utilization. The cows have to be used to it. If they're used to hearing the tractor coming, it's going to take a couple of years. We call them naive cows. And so, it's not going to be a perfect scenario in that first winter. And, start small. So just have a small pod of your bale grazing setup and then have your plan B, which might be some of them going back to the dry lot system. But it's going to take a couple of years. But I think eventually they're going to figure it out. The other thing is you give them 3 days of grazing and, you go out there in the morning and they're used to you coming out and they know they're going to get a fresh allocation. Well, guess what? Maybe go back and don't come back out till lunch. Just make them clean up some more because then the cows are telling you what to do. And so you just want to figure out how can these cows work for me, get their adequate nutrients, utilize that extensive system, leave their nutrients on that nutrient deficient area, and at the same time, you're saving money. You
and I were talking about this before we went on air, the joke, and I don't want any farmers to be offended with this, but I call those the cows that always expect that tractor to fire up every morning. We call them farmer cows because that's not how we operate because we're more of an open type system. There's guys that do it, and that's fine. Again, no offense. Hopefully nobody takes offense to that. But as you were talking about, a thought that went to my head is that, do we try that maybe with our younger cattle? Maybe our heifer calves or our bred heifers that we can start to train early on so that when they're older, they're not expecting that.
Well, that's an excellent point. And I'm glad you brought it up because, in my mind, I want my replacements developed under a system. I'm going to ask them to be a breeding female for the next 10 plus years and give me a cow. We do talk about feed efficiency in the beef industry. And in my mind, a feed efficient cow is a gestating beef cow that can survive on basal forage, be it a bale graze system or extensive grazing or native rangeland or winter range, and still get pregnant. So she can be the most feed efficient cow in the world. If she didn't get pregnant, she's no use to me. And give me a calf every year. So let's develop our heifers under this system. And we've done that research, Justin, we've done that work. And we found that we actually developed them in that extensive bale graze program and not at that benchmark of 65% mature body weight pre-breeding, which is a standard benchmark, and everybody has an appreciation for that. But we developed them a little bit lighter, about 55% mature body weight pre-breeding. We didn't see any negative impact on pregnancy or even out to the third calf. And the retention or repeatability in the herd wasn't an issue either. So train them like you want to manage them for their breeding life in your herd.
Yeah, you bet. Let's take another break here. When we come back, folks, we're going to continue on. Swath grazing is the next conversation I want to have with Dr. Lardner on this. By the way, this segment brought to you today by Zoetis. Back your instincts and feel more confident in your replacement selection this fall with Inherit Select from Zoetis. To find out more, go to their website at beefgenetics.com/working ranch to get started.
It's decision time. Which heifers are you keeping? Which are you selling? Make sort gate decisions easier with genomic EPDs for your commercial females. Back your instincts with Inherit Select from Zoetis. Feel more confident knowing you're selecting heifers with the potential to be the most productive and profitable in your herd. Keep the best. Sell the rest. Zoetis makes it easy. Order free supplies today so you can easily collect tissue samples when you work cattle this fall. Visit beefgenetics.com/working ranch to get started.
Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show. My guest today is Dr. Bart Lardner with the University of Saskatchewan. A great conversation we've been having. How do we extend that grazing? How can we look at reducing feed costs? And at the same time, if we are going to feed, using that as a mechanism to improve soil conditions. So we were talking about bale grazing in the last segment. Let's talk about swath grazing. Now it's going to kind of come in more on those that have hay fields and things like that. So let's talk about swath grazing.
Yeah, well, up here, swath grazing is again thinking outside the box. We're growing that annual cereal crop. And up here, we're looking at different types of cereals. Specifically, we're looking at barley, oat. We've looked at triticale as well. Fall rye is another one. But, what annual cereal, and you're right, we're going to grow that on that farmland or that annual crop land that we have on our operation. And so we're growing it. And instead of baling it up and bringing the bale back to the yard, we're actually putting it into a windrow. We're putting it into a row, cutting it, and we're going to have the cows walk out to that field and then utilize it. So, a couple of things with swath grazing is, again, you have to train your cows to go out there and utilize it in the field. If you do get some snow, we found that cows will actually dig down through that and find that windrow, up to 15 inches of snow and no problem at all. We get some pretty good snows in Alberta and Saskatchewan sometimes. So again, it's a system where the herd has to get used to it and you have to get used to moving that fence every 3 to 4 days. And so again, we're going to perimeter fence it with high tensile and use poly to give them 3 to 4 days of grazing. The other thing I didn't mention when I talked about bale grazing is that we start off with this 3 to 4 days of fresh allocation.
Okay.
But, the weather changes. And so we're going to see it drop below zero. Up here, I'm sorry, I talk in Celsius.
Yeah, I got it,
yeah. And I was talking in Celsius last week in Nebraska. The guys were kind of freaked out. Now, that's not Fahrenheit numbers.
Yeah.
Anyway, you need to adjust. You need to manage and monitor. And so if it gets real cold, maybe you're giving them 2 days of grazing because you're just trying to meet the energy needs. Up here, the deficient nutrient is really energy because of cold stress in our cold, dry winters. And so it's not... Yeah, protein is usually there in that annual cereal, that swath graze forage, but really it's energy that we're trying to provide in that second and third trimester of pregnancy. The other thing too is I say, look around, talk to your dealerships or seed sale guys, find that forage variety of barley, oat, or triticale. Up here, we're doing some research right now on a forage wheat. And so what do they look like? They're just big leafy plants. Mm-hmm. They're not putting as much in the seed head. It's that big leaf, that's the biomass that you want those cows available for those cows out in those swath grazing systems.
Yeah. We use a lot of millet hay around here. And one of the things I like about millet is the leaf on the stem is there for millet. That's really nice to have. When we talk about swath grazing, that kind of also dips into a little bit. You talked about some of the different varieties that are planted, but we kind of can get into some cover crop discussion here about some varieties in that seed mix. You kind of hit that just real briefly on what you're seeing there.
Yeah, we had lots of conversations about that with your neighbors in Nebraska. We're going to talk about it next week in Montana as well. But cover cropping, you're going to grow maybe a second crop on that cornfield or after you've taken that corn. And we did talk about some of those alternatives. You talked millet or furrow millet being a big conversation. Up here, we've looked at millets. We've looked at red proso and golden German. Both of those work very well. I like them. They're a warm season. They're a C4 like a corn, but they will produce most of their biomass in that August, that hotter month, if you like. And the one thing I found about the millet is that our wildlife didn't like it. So we have a lot of waterfowl up here. We have geese, Canada and snow geese, and they would fly right over that millet field, but they'd land in the barley field and eat everything. It's kind of crazy. The other neat thing about millet is it has that waxy cuticle, so we don't see as much weathering and nutrient loss with that freeze-thaw issue as we say with the barley or an oat. So, a couple of advantages with the millet. So find that variety that's going to work for you. It could be a warm season, it could be a cool season.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so specifically about the swath grazing, a question I'd have is why even swath it?
Well, okay, so yeah, we get asked that question all the time. It really is all about trying to get your herd or your cattle that are going to be out there grazing to utilize as much as possible. Generally, we'll see more of it wasted if we leave it standing. You can leave it standing and then move the fence that way accordingly. But we just, get better utilization if it's in a windrow versus it left standing, because we tend to see that even if we get a deep snow, they're going to be able to punch through and find that windrow. The other thing, I talk about nutrients coming out the back door. The ruminant animal is not very efficient at retaining nutrients in her diet. In fact, of all the nitrogen in that feed, only about 10% is retained and utilized by the cow. So 90% is passing out through the urine. So that's where we're taking advantage of that deposition of urine on that winter grazing site for the subsequent crop the following spring. And only about 20% of the phosphorus. So there's a great opportunity to utilize excretion of that ammonium nitrate, nitrogen, and that phosphorus. So the swath grazing being one of those systems.
Yeah. This kind of goes a little bit back to the bale grazing segment that we had in the last segment, but I want to address it here because it's similar in the fact that with swath grazing, it's laid out in a windrow like that. A lot of times for us, we roll hay out because we're in range conditions. We're not in lotted, so we're rolling things out. I'm sure that's better than a dry lot situation, but at the same time, the pros and cons that you think out of that, of rolling hay out versus bale grazing.
Yeah. No, that's another great system. And I think if it's working for you where you live, absolutely keep doing it. We did do some work on rolling it out on snow, on a fresh area of snow, and then having a cattle go out there and utilize it that way versus the bale grazing. The other way is what we looked at was that, or even rolling it out or using a bale processor, because some guys will have those bale busters. But my point is that cows have teeth. But anyway, what we found is that when we roll that bale out, or even use the processor to make a windrow with that bale, when the cows come and consume it, we found a lot of the higher quality structures of the bale, which is the qualities in the leaves, had settled down to the bottom. And so we saw that the animals actually were compacting a lot of that higher quality structure of the bale, and they're consuming more stem than we would care for. So what we did come away with and say, if you're going to roll it out, or if you're going to use a bale processor, if you do, by any chance, have some type of a portable bunk that's on skids, they just would tend to utilize most of the bale, best part of the bale, and not trap a lot of that in. In fact, we went to the measures, even collecting where we rolled that bale out or processed that bale, brought and took all that snow in that particular beating site and brought it in, and we found an awful lot of leaf material that was not consumed by the animals. So just something else to think about when you try to extend that grazing season by either rolling out bales or using a bale processor.
Yeah. Again, another question, it kind of reverts back to the bale grazing. What percentage would you figure can be used consumption-wise? Let's say we have a 1,500-pound bale, we stick it out there. What's going to get used?
Well, if they're consuming 85% or more, that's where you want to target. I've seen guys, in fact, when we did some other grazing, if it's only about 5% residue or 8-10% residue, on that nutrient deficient pasture, the grass just came back like crazy because grass loves nitrogen. So as I said, all that ends coming out in the urine. So we saw that tired old pasture turn into a brand new pasture, 2 to 3-fold increase in biomass. But, even after 3 years, we could see where those bales were. So it's a slow decomposition process, a slow composting process. So you're not wasting anything. It's just you're increasing the organic matter in that soil profile. And that's a good thing, right? So, and it's all about soil structure and soil organic matter is really what you're building up, the soil characterization of that tired old field for you to grow an annual or maybe a perennial down the road.
You bet. Okay, let's take another break here. When we come back, we're going to talk on grazing crop residuals, another way to reduce our feed costs and extend the grazing period as well. Welcome back to the Working Ranch Radio Show as we continue on. My guest today is Dr. Bart Lardner out of the University of Saskatchewan. And before we jump into the next thing here, Dr. Lardner, on grazing corn and corn residual, one of the things as we just were finishing up in the last conversation was I had asked about how much usage out of a bale are we going to see. And that's something in the back of my mind, even though I've had a hard time accepting it, in looking at that percentage that is not being used to go into the cow, is that percentage is going into the ground. And if we were to look at the cost of fertilizer and putting that all together, we're going to be money way ahead knowing what we're doing.
Well, with the work we've done, and we've measured actually, the amount of ammonium nitrate nitrogen left behind after an extensive grazing program. I always like to have this conversation because the cropping guys that are just straight calf crop, and we hear this conversation more and more. We're trying to get the two in a partnership. The livestock guys talking to the cropping guys. And so, yes, the livestock guy is going to pay a land rent for the cows to go out there and utilize that residue or whatever, corn stalks or whatever. But after I do my talk, should be the inverse. The cropping guy should be paying the livestock guy for all the nutrients that are left behind because of the high cost of nitrogen, right? So It's huge. It's unbelievable what's left behind.
Yeah, definitely some ways to work together between those two entities for sure. Okay, let's talk about crop residuals. And specifically, I know as you and I were talking before we went on air, down here in the States, there's a lot of corn stalks that we graze on. Folks will graze on. You up north in Canada, more on the full corn. You've not even harvested or anything like that. So let's just address that subject of crop residuals.
Yeah, we can talk about how we utilize whole plant corn, and I'll also touch on what we call residue grazing up here. And so we're utilizing the residues from a calf crop like an oat or a pea, like a pulse crop. We grow corn. In fact, in my career, I've seen, not very many corn acres in our province of Saskatchewan to quite a few. And I've seen the breeding companies have really found low heat unit varieties that will grow for our growing degree days, or corn heat units, if you like. So the first thing, as I mentioned previously, is that our biggest, nutrient that's lacking in our extensive grazing, because of the cold stress, we get sub-zero weather, we'll get minus 30 Celsius for a couple of weeks on end. And so if that cow's in good body condition, good hair coat, good wind protection, portable windbreak, she can persist out there very, very comfortably. So instead of us bringing an energy supplement out to the field, let's ask her to graze that whole plant corn. And we have a lot of what we call grazing varieties up here. The companies were selling those to producers. And so when it started taking off, the seed sales, folks were selling it to the producer. They would put out 15 acres of corn or maybe 80 acres of corn, whole plant. And then my phone would start ringing off the wall. How do I utilize this crop? It takes a while. I say start out small again, maybe just grow 5-10 acres, because it's a really adaptation period type program. Usually your cows are used to, listening to the tractor coming with the feed wagon. Well, all of a sudden we put them out in this field and say, hey, guess what? You got to go eat these small trees. And when we first started doing our research, they would graze everything but the corn plant. They go around, they eat all the dead grass around the fence post. And then about day 3, some smart old girl would go over and take a bite of corn, and then we're off to the races. Everybody kind of leader-follower business. The big thing we're saying is that hold back, allocate 3 to 4 days of grazing. In the first day, we know that cows are very selective, and they do tend to consume mostly cob. So we want them to, basically, we want to have that, when the first killing frost hits, which is usually about September 15th for us, we want at least 50% starch and 50% fiber in that corn field. And so when they're consuming, as you know, too much cob, that's obviously going to turn into rumen acidosis. And so we want to make sure they're getting some fiber in that consumption, in that daily diet. And so we put out a little bit of old hay bales just so they get that fiber in their diet. We don't wind up with those cows going down with subacute rumen acidosis. And then day 2 and 3, then obviously they're going to get more fiber in their diet. And so that's where we're saying move the fence every 3 to 4 days. We have had folks that grow whole plant corn, put 200 cows out on 40 acres and wind up in a train wreck. And so we see lots of guys, the vets are phoning me and say, you know what, this guy didn't limit graze, and it was problems one after the other. So it's just kind of common sense.
On the corn stalks that you see down here in the States, more grazing on that, your thoughts on that?
Yeah. It's an unbelievable alternative system for you folks. And, when I was just down there, I saw a lot of cows out on stalks, and what a great thing. Because, the ruminant has evolved to digest fiber. That's how she evolved. Like, don't kid yourself. And so if we can put a low quality fiber, especially in that first trimester pregnancy, she doesn't need very high energy or protein. And so we can really put her on those low quality, high fiber type of stockpile forages, corn residue being a fantastic one. Her ability to pick and utilize whatever seeds came over the back of the combine or green material or leaves, that's unbelievable. And so they get used to that. They get very good at, sorting that residue and finding the higher quality structures.
One of the things that I have heard some horror stories a little bit in terms of guys sending cattle to corn stalks, or of course they're cattle that have never been around any of that kind of stuff. Not that it can't be done, but I think there needs to be some caution or some process in how that goes with those cows. Am I correct?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where that adaptation period has to come in. If they'd been killed with kindness and run around with a chop tail all the time on the farm or the ranch and spoiled, if you like, then you do have to be patient, and you do have to extend that adaptation period. Put them out on stalks, but maybe give them some other supplemental hay or something, and then slowly wean them off that until they're just consuming stalks feed test. I say no matter what residue it is, whether it's corn stalks or oat residue, straw chaff. We graze a lot of straw chaff up here. And then you'll know what you're dealing with, because if you have to bring in an energy or protein supplement, so be it. But the other thing, too, that I've learned, and the cows fooled me in this instance, is that we thought we would graze straw chaff from pea residue. We'd grow a good 40-10 silage pea and then leave the straw and chaff. Well, for some reason, there was some constituent within that straw and chaff. They just didn't consume it. They didn't like the taste of it, if you like, and they just would not utilize it. And so sometimes what we think as a producer is the best residue for the cows, they'll say no. There's an issue. But so going around with whatever, I found that depending on the color of the combine, there's more or less thrown out the back, so the cows are happier, if you like. So we put our straw and chaff into like a 50-pound pile. We use what we call a hole buncher behind the combine, and it collects the straw and chaff. And then through a weight trip process, it dumps these 50, 60-pound piles in the field. The cows will go in there, they'll figure it out right away. They go in there and they vacuum up all the chaff right away, and then they're left with the straw, as you can imagine. And that's when you're going to be a little more strict on them and say, hey, you got to eat some of that straw. You just don't get a chaff diet. So. Mm-hmm.
All right, just a few more questions here, and let's address the economics in all of this, because I think that's one of the things that has to be looked at in this, and that as you're potentially looking at this, you could maybe introduce bale grazing, and that would be a way you might be able to find and utilize some lower quality feed. But if you're going to do that, there's going to have to be some ways to make that ration or that diet complete for that animal. But let's just address real quickly here the economics of all of this just in general.
Well, when I do a presentation, I do throw up our costs. And we work with production economists up here, and we've got some really good ones. And they bring in a lot of costs that producer Bob or Betty probably wouldn't add in their calculation, and that's fine. But we really do bring in all those costs when we do our calculations. And all of our research, we try to put an economic spin on it, because that's really what captures the attention of the listener. But those are the costs that I encourage when I did that study in the years that I did it, in the location that I did it. What are your costs? And so that is an issue that a lot of folks don't like to keep records. They don't like to keep or know their costs. But when I throw those benchmarks up there, everybody's thinking about, what does it cost me where I farm or where I ranch? And so it gets people thinking, and that's a good thing. But all of our work that we've done and comparing it to dry lot feeding, which is kind of our control, if you like, we range from 8 to 20 to 30% reduced feed cost per cow per day, because we use that extensive system. For example, some of our swath graze work, it's generally 25 to 30% lower. Our residue grazing is 30% lower compared to dry lot. Our corn is about 26% lower, and our stockpile forage is about 50% lower. Than that's in the years that we did it. Mm-hmm. So, with today's cost for diesel, machinery, all those things, I can only imagine it's probably a little bit higher. So if you can grow that crop, and if you consume it whole plant, or you consume the residues, or you bring in hay or whatever, so be it. Mm-hmm. On that nutrient-deficient acre of land. The big thing is that you're trying to capture those manure nutrients, and you're trying to have less tractor starts.
Yeah, and I think another thing when you think of the economics of stuff, if you raise your own hay, now we don't raise a lot of our own hay. We just started incorporating another place where it does produce a little hay. But I have to charge myself what it would cost me to replace that hay. I think if you're going to be fair with your daily costs.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, you have to bring in a lot of those costs, opportunity costs too as well, right? Paid labor, as I said, yardage costs. So at the end of the day, it's moving those cows to where that forage is and having the cows consume it, versus you growing it, processing it, hauling it, feeding it in a different location. And so with all these different systems we've talked about here, figure out which one you might even just start to try on your operation in a small scale first.
Yeah, for sure. And that's, as we kind of wrap up, there's a couple takeaways. I see the benefits from the soil nutrients and putting that back. I think we can all see that. And the two takeaways beyond that I see is starting small and be patient. Don't expect, everything to happen in the first year. It's a process through this. And those are the two takeaways that I have.
Yeah, absolutely. You picked the eyes out of our conversation, so to speak. And and as I said, I've had lots of follow-up phone calls and emails wherever I'm doing my talk. And it just gets people thinking differently. And with all of this regenerative conversation going on today and soil health and sustainability and all these buzzwords, in my mind, we just come back to integrating the four-legged ruminant on that acre of land, utilizing that basal forage and stop.
Yep. Have the animal working for you instead of us working for the animal. So, you bet.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Dr. Lardner, thank you for joining us here on the Working Ranch Radio Show. I sure appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad my agenda was open today to have that conversation, Justin.
You bet.
Take care.
You bet. And again, Dr. Bart Lardner out of the University of Saskatchewan has been our guest here today. He's a professor there in the Department of Animal Science, and definitely on a subject here today that has been around as we started in our conversation earlier today. I'm sure a lot of folks have heard about bale grazing or swath grazing. Nevertheless, it's maybe something that you haven't dipped your toe in completely. I know for myself personally, I've done just a little bit of it from time to time, but really to jump into it and start small, as Dr. Lardner was talking about, I can say that I honestly haven't really done that and followed through, but it's something for our operation, for example, where we're backgrounding some heifers here and for the most part on pretty much full feed, might be a way to utilize the resources that's coming out there back in on some areas to improve the grazing in those areas, or even improve some fields that might need some replenishing in nutrients in their soil as well. So interesting subject. I think there's a lot to pull out of that. Definitely a subject here today that probably want to go back and listen to the show as well. You can find that again at workingranchradio.com is the podcast site, or any podcast provider out there as well. Stay with us. When we come back, the captain checks in and we'll hear from meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather.
Fascinated by our wild weather? Now you can learn, appreciate, and understand the weather in your own backyard with the new Tropo Rain Gauge. Having achieved the highest rating of any product reviewed by the weatherstationexperts.com, the Tropo boasts rugged durability, impeccable accuracy, and precision to the 100th of an inch. Visit measurerain.com to order a Tropo today and use code RAINDAY. That's RAINDAY for free shipping and 10% off. Go to measurerain.com.
Hey, Justin. Hey, everybody out there in Working Ranch Radio Land. I hope your fall's going great. Couple of pieces of advice for you good folks out there. If you are not already Beef Quality Assurance BQA certified, I want you to go and look into it. It's easy to do. You just go online and it takes a couple hours. I did it. I've got my cow-calf and I've got my transportation certification. So obviously it's the cool thing to do. So just go ahead and do that. Second piece of advice, folks, this fall, I want you to back off on the speed of your cattle and your horse work by 10%. Just do it. It's going to be safer for everybody. It's going to be easier on the cattle, easier on your horses, easier on the crew too. You know, you don't need to get all uptight about certain things just because that critter didn't go through that gate or whatever. Just calm down, take it easy, smile. Do a lot of smiling out there when you're working cattle with your family. Trust me, it'll be the best thing you ever did. Back to you in the booth, Justin.
All right, thanks, Captain. And I'm kind of chuckling just a little bit here because, in fact, I do own a T-shirt that says, quote, "Sorry for what I said while we were working cattle," unquote. So anyways, I'm sure others could use that T-shirt as well, but I thought that was applicable in light of your topic here today. Well, as we switch towards our weather, joining us as he does each and every week is meteorologist Don Day. And Don, I know when we started the month of November, you said we were going to start drifting a little bit more into a winter weather pattern. And while we have seen a little bit cooler mornings, it's been actually nice to see some pretty good moisture across the country.
Well, yeah, we've been able to, in some parts of the U.S., get some really good amounts of moisture. And also, you mentioned temperature. We haven't had anything that would be described as a big winter chill or something that's been bringing in severe cold, at least yet. And what's really remarkable is the moisture we've seen over the Southern Rockies and Southern Plains. You look at the moisture that's fallen over parts of New Mexico, Colorado, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas. A lot of those areas, when we get the new drought monitor out, will show basically an erasure of any dry conditions down there. We've also basically seen a situation where temperatures have been, over a large part of the U.S., above average for the month of November, which continues the trend that we had in October.
Mm-hmm. As you talked about improved conditions, we had seen an improvement just with the moisture we've gotten. I've been telling folks, I don't remember November where we've seen the kind of moisture that we've had that's come in the form that it has. Normally, you could get it in snow, but it's been in a lot of rain, which is what we've really seen across the board of the country.
Yeah, in fact, the storms that have gone across the Southern Rockies and Southern Plains have reminded me more of a spring pattern, as opposed to one that you would get in the fall, because of the available water and the fact that a lot of it was in the form of rain. A lot of it was snow in parts of New Mexico and Colorado, but also there were places that didn't see accumulating snow. And for November, that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. So as we look ahead, we're just, a couple weeks out here from the end of the month, which of course would be Thanksgiving, a lot of travel for folks, families, and kids moving back and forth from college and things like that. What do you anticipate as we continue to move into the latter part of November?
Well, I think we're going to get more stormy, and I do see it getting colder. In fact, I think there's going to be a rather large system moving across the central United States here as we go into the next week ahead. That's going to be able to tap into some colder air from Canada. And we're going to see the snow come, at least the chances of accumulating snow, kind of get off the mountain slopes now and go out a little bit further out into the plains, especially the northern plains. And I think that's going to lend itself to a pattern that's going to be colder for the end of the month into early December. Now, you'd expect that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I do think it's some of the bigger pushes of cold air that we've seen this fall season. So we've been able to hold back the real cold for a while, but I think our luck's running out.
Yeah. So I guess the other thing is, how much is the Midwest going to see? I'm guessing that the corn harvest is well underway. I was just trying to, I haven't seen the latest reports to see where they're at with the crop conditions and progress reports on that. But is there going to be much weather across that Midwest and that Corn Belt area?
Yes, there will. In fact, there's very good chances for a wet period coming up over especially the central and western and northwest Corn Belt. Now, it'll start as rain. I do think eventually that maybe by the time the system winds down, we will see some, as I mentioned, we'll finally see the snow get a little bit further down into the plain. So for remaining harvest operations, they're going to have some weather challenges. Now, they've had a great harvest weather pattern, really. They've had some wet periods, but they've also had some stretches to where the harvest was really unimpeded by the weather, but I think the luck is running out there as well.
All right. Well, Don, appreciate the update here. We'll look forward to talking to you next week.
See you then.
You bet. And again, that is meteorologist Don Day with a look at our long-term weather. If you want to tune in each and every morning to his daily video podcast, you can find the link to that YouTube channel by going to his website at dayweather.com. Well, if you're a regular listener to the program and you get this far into the show, for the last couple of weeks I've been telling you that we are going to have Wally Olson in here as our guest. And you're probably thinking I'm kind of a liar here, but in full transparency, he will be on our program at some point. He's got a school coming up. Things kind of got hectic for him, so we had to postpone that interview here a little bit later. But of course, if you're not familiar with Wally, he does do the schools on the sell by marketing that Bud Williams, of course, originally had out there and has kind of modeled some of his school off of those principles. So I'm looking forward to visiting with Wally, not only just in some of that aspect, but also really what he thinks and what his feeling is in this market with what we're seeing here today and some of these record high cattle prices. Now, I do want to thank our sponsors before we leave here today. Barn Owl Cameras. It's what we use here on our ranch operations to monitor remote situations. Cow Puncher Coffee. Inherit Select from Zoetis, Tank Toad, and Smart Lick. Not just another tub, it's a dependable way to get results. Find out more at smartlick.com. That's smartlic.com. The Working Ranch Radio Show is a production of Working Ranch Magazine, branded #1 by America's Ranchers. My email address is justin.workingranch@gmail.com. Don't forget to leave us a rating or a review. We sure do appreciate that. I'm Justin Mills, and until next time, keep your chin down and your mind in the middle. So long.